Hi everyone. I'd like to share with you today my presentation, Neuro-Ecological Diversity, an alternative to shaming narratives. Now, one of the things that I want to start off by saying is that neuroecological diversity is a concept that came out of the neuroplastic narrative, which is a paper I wrote and had published last year in 2023. That paper is a consumer narrative. So I am a consumer of mental health services, as well as being a mental health nurse and a neuroscientist. It was what I learned in neuroscience that has enabled me to come up with this non-pathologizing but still biological framework for understanding the impact of trauma and adversity. So neuroecological diversity is what I'll be talking about today. But first I want to just make a note about the white and black wolf that you see on the screen. It seems to me that value gets attached to emotions, behaviours and colours rather inappropriately. And it's this that I'm really wanting to overturn, the value that we might place, particularly on feelings and behaviours when they're outcomes. So we'll crack on, but really might help if we keep in mind that the white wolf is more about order and the black wolf is more about chaos. One evening, an old Cherokee told his grandson about a battle that goes on inside people. He said, "My son, the battle is between two wolves inside us all. One is evil. It is anger, envy, jealousy, greed, sorrow, arrogance, guilt, resentment, and lies. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, humility, kindness, empathy, forgiveness, compassion, and truth." And the grandson thought about it a moment and then asked his grandfather, "Which wolf wins?" And the old Cherokee simply replied, "The one you feed." Now, this idea of the one you feed and this story has a simple appeal to it, but I think it's problematic because the one you feed could potentially imply that we have a choice about whether that we are good or bad inside of us. But I'm not sure that that's right, because I think sometimes what we're fed by is the experiences we have from our ecology, and by which I mean our ecology includes our earliest relationships, so those early relational and familial and social ecologies that we learn our world through and from. But if it is about choice, it's problematic for this reason. Because if you don't choose to be good, then what does that make you? So here we're focusing on the black wolf, we're focusing in on chaos. So if we are not able to live by the rules of society, if we aren't controlled enough of our emotions or behaviours, we fall outside what's sort of normal, then we may get called mad. On the other hand, if we choose not to go along with these laws that we have in society, then that would be bad, so we would be criminalised. Now, the problem with these narratives is that they're both shaming. To not feel that you're in control of yourself, that you have agency or autonomy over your feelings and your behaviours is quite frightening, but it also feels quite shaming to not have that sort of control. Not to mention that if you're also diagnosed with a mental illness, then that may carry shame and stigma that you also have to sort of manage in your life. And in the criminal justice system, we actually use shame as a punishment. We try and shame people as a disincentive for them to act that way again. I don't think that works, but that's a whole other workshop. Even when we're trying to be trauma informed, as of course the adverse childhood experience study started off that kind of movement of wanting to be trauma informed, we can still inadvertently fall into pathologizing language. You'll see here, adverse childhood experiences is at the base of the pyramid, and then we have social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. That's quite a strong word to use for people who've been through adversity. Even when they updated the pyramid, the adverse childhood experience study was the pyramid was updated, they added in a layer of disrupted neurodevelopment. So now we have disrupted neurodevelopment and social, emotional, cognitive impairment coming on the back of early adversity. And these terms, of course, are shaming. You're less than. If you're impaired, you're less than someone who isn't impaired. If your neurodevelopment is disrupted, it's less than someone whose neurodevelopment is normal or undisrupted. So again, we fall back into this pattern of shame. And the problem with shame is it actually drives the very behaviours that we're most wanting to address. Let's look at that more closely. So if we've been through trauma or adversity in our childhoods, the chances are we will be already carrying shame. Some of that shame may be transgenerational. If we have transgenerational trauma, we'll have transgenerational shame. But also there's the shaming that we then receive from messages from society to us about how we are less than. So we carry shame, and then we are on top of that shamed through the shaming that goes on around us. The expression of that shame is what drives distressed and distressing behaviours and health-harming behaviours. I put it to all of you, when you're feeling crap about yourself, what are you most likely to do? What do you most feel like doing? Do you feel like going and eating ice cream or extra biscuits or having a cigarette or having a glass of wine? Do you do these things that ultimately may harm your health in the long term? Or when you're feeling terrible about yourself, do you think, I know, I'll have a salad, that'll cheer me up? So it seems that when we feel bad about ourselves, we're more likely to do something that validates how bad we feel about ourselves by doing something that we know isn't good for us. That's just sort of what I observe. It also drives distressed and distressing behaviours. And here I'll talk about my own self-harm, which all came from shame and an intensity around self-hate and self-loathing. The self-harm comes from distress, but of course it's also distressing for others. And itself, it can be pathologized. If I had shown up in front of a psychiatrist with self-harm and the trauma history that I have and the way that it was playing out in my life, the chances are I would have got diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. I did not want that diagnosis, and so I stayed away from anyone who could have given it to me. I genuinely believe that was one of my wiser choices in my life. But the other aspect, of course, is the rage and hate that I was feeling was self-directed. But imagine if that had been directed to someone else. Imagine if I'd done the harm that I've done to myself to another person. Well, I would be a criminal if I did that, because I would have done significant harm to another person. So this shame that gets displayed as these distressed and distressing behaviours that can come out as violence, can come out as health-harming behaviours, can be pathologized and criminalized, and these narratives are also of themselves shaming. So you can see how we can get caught in this vicious cycle. So I think we need a new lens here to help us think differently. And I love this quote. Research is to see what everybody else has seen and to think what nobody else has thought. Now, I'm not making the claim that no one else has thought this. That would be rather arrogant and bold. Not at all. I've stood on the shoulders of giants myself. But the lens that I'm advocating for is this one, an evolutionary lens where we look at adaptation. So here we're moving away from a pathological lens where we pathologize the individual, and what we're moving towards is an ecological lens where we look at the ecology the individual has been forged in, has grown up in. So we're looking at the landscape, we're looking at what's around. The question we're asking is, how has this person been shaped by their environment? But first of all, we might need a little foray into neuroplasticity, which, as some of you may know, is the thing that I talk about all the time. So the way that I like to think about neuroplasticity is to think about how our experiences shape our brains and physiologies. And often it helps to think about this in terms of using a water metaphor. So raindrops of experience shaping the landscape of our brains and bodies. So think of experiences as being like raindrops. So one raindrop on its own doesn't make a huge amount of difference, but lots of raindrops, rain itself really does. And what happens to the water is it collects at the lowest point and then it travels down a pathway, always downhill actually with water. the easiest route. Well, the same with experiences. When they create and run down neural pathways, they run down the pathway of least resistance. But as they do so, they wear out a groove so that the next time there's a new experience like that, it's going to run down a groove that's already there. So we forge these pathways into our brain as we do into the land. We know that great bodies of water move down rivers. It moves a huge volume of water, and the same with experiences. If there are many, many experiences that are the same or similar, they'll wear a neural pathway over and over and over, and it will become myelinated, so faster and more efficient is essentially what that means, and more automatic. So just as rain shapes the whole of the landscape, so experiences shape the landscape, the structure and function of our brains. As this cartoon shows, the flow of our experiences over the landscape of our brains shapes us whether we like it or not. We don't consent to this. This is what happens. Now, how do experiences really shape brains? Well, if any of you are interested in having a day workshop on that, then I would be delighted to come and give one. But the ways that I know and would normally talk about, but it's not an exhaustive list, are the following: epigenetics, neurogenesis, synaptic plasticity, and white matter plasticity. But more interestingly, for the purposes of this talk, why? Why is it that we've evolved mechanisms that embed the experiences we've had under our skin, and specifically into our brains and into our physiology? And the reason for that is because adapting to our environment, our unique ecological niche, helps us to survive in it. And this is what Darwin meant when he talked about survival of the fittest. He wasn't talking about like the most fit. He wasn't talking about the strongest. He was talking about those of us that have adapted most closely to fit our environment. So think of it this way. When we're born, we're quite light on experiences, but we gain more and more experiences. And these experiences that we have had, they form anticipations of the kinds of experiences we're likely to have based on the past experiences that we have had. So we've come to anticipate, because we've amassed all of this information about the kinds of things that happen to us. So if we've had a lot of experiences of threat, we'll come to anticipate threat, and we'll also come to perceive things as though they are a threat, okay? Because that's what anticipation is. It's a bit like that book, The Secret, where we manifest what we anticipate. It's kind of like that, but also not like that. There are some very good kind of biological reasons for why it ends up being that way. So these experiences we have in our ecological niche fit us to our ecological niche. So think, when we're born, we haven't had many experiences, so there's like space in our brains and bodies for experiences to kind of take shape and fit us to our environment. And what happens is, as we acquire those experiences, they make us the kind of right shape and right colour for the ecology that we're actually in. And then as we transition into adults, we then become part of that picture. And that's for that side of that picture, the landscape that we're in. And the same happens on the other side. The same process happens on the other side. But the experiences we'll have in this part of the picture are a different colour. So we'll still come to fit our environment, but it will be a fit for a different environment. But again, as we become adults, we then become part of the picture. But of course, we're not jigsaw puzzle pieces. We are actually individuals with brains. And what happens is, as I've just said with the jigsaw puzzle pieces, our brains and physiology are sculpted by the ecological niche that we are in, so we become individuals that are fit for that ecological niche. But more than that, we become part of the picture, so then we are adults that form the ecological niche for the next generation. And I believe that this is the mechanism for transgenerational trauma. So just to recap, just as different ecologies shape trees differently, so different social, emotional, and relational ecologies shape brains and physiologies differently. Different social, emotional, and relational ecologies make different kinds of brains and physiologies. So think about what I've said about how our experiences shape our anticipations. So imagine you have infrequent experiences of trauma and other adversity, but lots of experiences of stability and predictability and routines where you're safe and well resourced, your relationships are safe and well resourced, and the communities are too. So threat is rare. And those relationships are emotionally and physiologically regulating. So if you've had many, many experiences that fall into these kinds of categories, then what you'll come to anticipate is that traumatic events and adversity will be rare and manageable. You'll come to anticipate predictability and stability, and in a predictable world, planning works. So make plans. They're likely, not always, but they're likely to come off. As you anticipate, because you've had lots of experiences of your community being safe, you'll anticipate it will continue to be safe. And as you become part of the picture, you will contribute to your community being safe. And in relationships, those relationships have been regulating. So you'll anticipate that they'll continue to be that way, and you'll contribute to those relationships being regulating by showing up and doing your part, looking after your relationships because they look after you. So the kind of brain that might produce is a brain that's orientated to stability and safety, that maximizing future opportunities, making the most of developing executive function and making the most of it, being able to be reflective and empathic. It's a brain that's much less preoccupied with immediate threats. There's not a great deal of space given over to it. That's 86 billion neurons learning a safe and predictable world where people care and are capable of responding, where emotions are tolerable, where planning often, not always, but often works out. It works out often enough to make it worth doing. Where gratification can be delayed, you'll be around to collect that delayed reward, with interest if you're lucky. Where it pays again to be reflective and empathic, because these are good long-term strategies for relationships. Also, where you can get relational regulation. This is the kind of brain those experiences are likely to build. But of course, on the other side of the picture, things are a bit different. What if you've had frequent experiences of trauma and other adversity? What if you've lived in instability, unpredictability, maybe chaos? What if relationships and communities, the experiences you have of them, are that they're threatened from the outside or threatening when you're on the inside? And that relationships are often emotionally and physiologically dysregulating. So if that's your suite of typical experiences, what are you going to come to anticipate? Well, more trauma and adversity in the future. You're going to anticipate that plans aren't going to work out and that you have to make the most of what's available in the moment. And this will make you more impulsive and opportunistic and exploitative than you might otherwise have been, because that's the way to make your way in this kind of a world. If you anticipate that relationships and communities are threatened or threatening, then you're going to prepare for that threat. And the best form of defense is attack. If I'm super threatening, I'm not going to be threatened by anyone else. It's not a strategy I'm condoning, but it is one that I'm trying to describe. And similarly, if you experience that your relationships are often dysregulating, then where do you get regulation from? Where do you get to distract? Where do you get to reliably go to something that makes you feel better? Well, it may be that alcohol or drugs or compulsive behaviours, addictive behaviours, process addictions we might call them, are the most reliable ways that you may discover to distract from or regulate yourself. And that's going to create a brain that's very preoccupied with immediate threat, very preoccupied with survival and regulation, but has had fewer experiences that build the brain's capacity for executive function and even more so for future opportunities. Because you can't focus on future opportunities if you're under immediate threat. That would be absurd. That would be ignoring the snake in front of you to think about your career path later on. Like, you have to deal with the immediacy of the threat that's in front of you in order to be able to have a long term. And if you never get away from that immediate threat, And of course, you're always organised by it. So here we have 86 billion neurons making the best of a threatening and unpredictable world, where the experiences are that people either don't care or do harm or at least are unreliable, where emotions are extreme, so there is a desperate seeking for regulation from anywhere. I speak as someone in recovery from addiction myself, looking always for that regulation and a sense of stability and safety. If you can't plan, as I said, you become impulsive and exploitative. It's the bird in the hand. It's the make hay while the sun shines, carpe diem. It's don't delay gratification. It's that whole thing about the kids and the marshmallows. It's not that some kids are smarter than others. It's that the kids who decide, I'll come back tomorrow and have two, have faith that you will do what you say you're going to do. And the kids are like, that's all right, I'll just take the one now, thanks. They're the ones that don't believe you that you're going to be back tomorrow with two. They'll take what's available now because that's the smart thing that they've learned to do. So we end up with this brain that is preoccupied with immediacy. And that shows up in how we use our agency. More about that another time. But preoccupied with immediate threat, survival and regulation, but has had too little experience to really be able to build this capacity for executive function and to orientate to, just hasn't had the opportunity to orientate to the future. So what I want to say is that both of these brains are perfectly adapted to the ecology in which they were forged. One of them isn't good and the other bad. One of them isn't sick or damaged and the other healthy or normal. It is the same neuroplastic mechanisms that have built these different brains from different experiences to survive in different ecological niches. There is absolutely no pathology in the mechanisms themselves. So as our ideas of pathology fade, what emerges from that is a sense of difference and appreciation of difference. So what comes forward is this idea of neuro-ecological diversity, which is differences between people's biological, psychological, behavioral responses that arise as a consequence of their brains and physiologies having developed in different ecologies of development. One isn't better than the other. One might be more desirable than the other, but that doesn't make it better. It doesn't make it normal. It doesn't make it healthy. So, over the past several years, the neurodiversity movement has challenged how readily difference is pathologized and instead has called for an appreciation of difference. And I am making a parallel point here. We wouldn't, for example, pathologize these trees. Hold on. These trees here, or call them attention seeking. It probably wouldn't occur to us to come up with this idea that perhaps they have a genetic predisposition that makes them vulnerable to the effects of wind. We wouldn't accuse these trees of being narcissistically disordered or OCD with perfectionist traits or, forgive me, or of having body dysmorphia or, lastly, for hoarding. So just keep in mind when you're working with neuroecological diversity, which you all are, all of the time, we are all unique because of the experiences that we have had that have shaped us. Keep in mind, a healthy brain is a brain that can adapt, even if what it's adapting to is terrible circumstances, undesirable circumstances. If it can adapt, it's a healthy brain. Be curious and not judgmental about that. Think, in what context would what I'm seeing here make sense? And then make kind sense of people. They're doing the best they can with what they have. Drop that shaming language and these framings of damaged, toxic, bad, sick. It's not helpful. And ask instead, or wonder with the person, wonder for yourself, what kind of new experiences might be helpful to put you on or keep you on a trajectory that you want to be on. Maybe different to the one that you're on now. It may not. And also retain some hope. Neuroplasticity means at some level we're all like cubs. We can all learn new things. We're all neuroplastic. It's a feature of neural systems to be neuroplastic. It doesn't go away. It doesn't matter how old you are. And how neuroplastic you are is itself neuroplastic. So the more you orientate yourself to new experiences, things that can change you, especially experiences that are going to change you in the way that you might desire, you're going to up your neuroplasticity and your capacity for that. So you're orientating yourself to change. For me, coming out of self-harm, the new experience I had was relating in a different way to a psychotherapist than I had ever related to anyone else. It took a long time, right? Because I was very mistrustful. Who wouldn't be, right? Given the experiences I'd had. So it took a long time, but he showed up for me in a way that no one ever had, and he listened in a way that no one ever had, and he made kind sense of me in a way that no one ever had. And so these experiences that were novel ways of relating, it enabled me to be gentler with myself, to make kinder sense of myself. And I wouldn't say I've nailed it, but I would say that I'm on the right track. So those were the new experiences I had that shaped and changed things for me. This is a terrible slide, and I wouldn't use it as a presentation slide, except that I'm looking for research partners. So here is some program logic for implementing this aspect of the neuroplastic narrative and this concept of neuro-ecological diversity. As I said, the neuroplastic narrative is a biological but non-pathologizing, trauma-informed model of care. And as well as talking about the shame cycle, there's two opportunities here to intervene with shame. There's one to think about the shame that each of us carry. So many of us, even though we might look quite shiny on the outside, may carry a lot of shame in us. So one way is to reduce the shame that we carry in us. And the other is to reduce the shaming that we do of others, some of which may be inadvertent, and some of which we may find is, or we may believe is instrumental in being a disincentive to reducing the behaviours we don't want to have. I'm not sure about that, but as I say, that's work for another time. But there are these two opportunities for addressing shame that I'm interested in doing some research on, if anyone would like to join me in that. And lastly, this is, I promise, my last slide. Rather unhelpfully, my image on this recording has covered up my name, and I don't think I can do anything about that. No. An email address. If you would like to email me, it's haley.peckham@unimelb.edu.au, but Haley is spelt Haley, not Hayley. The two QR codes on the flyers in front of you. On the left, Dr. Haley Peckham's Neuroplastic Narrative. These are the workshops that I do. If you're interested in those, scan the QR code and do make contact with us at the email address below. And on the right-hand side is an invitation to research. Again, you can contact us on either my email address that I've just given you or the Training Inquiries email address that will still get to me eventually. Thanks for listening.